See, I was a rationalist. I only was willing to believe what I could understand. And at the time, Christianity had answered all of the questions that I had. But now came the new wave of atheism, and they were asking new questions. And I was very, very seriously hunting down the answers as rapidly as possible.
Hello, and thanks for joining in. I'm Jana Harmon, and you're listening to Sci-Bi Stories, where we see how skeptics flip the record of their lives. Each podcast, we listen to someone who has once been an atheist or skeptic, but who became a Christian against all odds. You can hear more of our stories on our website at scibistories.com or on our YouTube channel. We always welcome your comments and feedback on these stories on our Facebook page and again on our YouTube channel. You can also directly email us at info@scibistories.com. We love hearing from you. Deconstruction has become an all too frequent word heard around Christian circles over the past few years. We often hear about Christians who once believed but had deconstructed their faith all the way to deconversion. They leave their faith behind completely without looking back. But through deconstruction, not all who begin to question their beliefs about God and the Bible leave Christianity. Sometimes their doubts take them on an earnest journey toward discovering the depths of truth that they may not have known before. Sometimes they find a rich, more robust faith than the fragile one that they began questioning. Sometimes the wandering is worth it, despite the precarious nature of not knowing exactly where their path is going to end up. Adam Terry took a journey through skepticism to honestly search to determine whether or not Christianity was true and worthy of belief. For him, his journey of deconstruction was worth it because his faith was reconstructed. He found a more solid foundation of knowledge and surprising deeper experience of faith than he had experienced before. His story is a bit different than others in this podcast in that he never completely left his faith behind. But his struggle with Christianity, as well as his resulting wisdom and advice, are worth listening to. I hope you'll come along to hear it. Welcome to Sci-Bi Stories, Adam. It's so great to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me.
So the listeners know a bit about who you are, Adam. Why don't we begin here by you telling us a little bit about yourself, perhaps where you live, what you do, and your ministry?
Yeah, so my name's Adam. I live in North Carolina currently. I kind of grew up in a military home, so I endured 20 years of my dad going through the military, but he ultimately retired on the East Coast, and so now I live here. So currently I teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's a pretty rewarding process, getting to see people grow up and train and develop themselves. And actually before that, I actually did have a few amateur fights in the cage, for those that are familiar with MMA. So I've pretty much done the fighting on all three fronts, whether it's spiritual, mental, or actually physical.
Wow.
And currently, I run the Curious Christianity YouTube channel, and soon-to-be podcast will be coming out.
Well, let's get into your story, Adam. Tell us, you said you're from a military family. Where were you born? What was that family life like? And was God any part of your family life?
Yeah, so I was born actually in Oregon, on the West Coast, and pretty much we lived all up and down the entire West Coast: California, Oregon, Washington, and then ultimately Hawaii, and then my dad retired in Virginia. Kind of growing up in a military household, a military family can be a little bit hard because you don't have that consistency of friendships, school, and all those things. So I did grow up in a Christian home, but kind of the loneliness and the struggles of almost experiencing a type of abandonment with my own dad, even though he was a tremendously loving father. And I really couldn't put it any better than he was super ideal in so many ways. There's still just a way that you kind of disconnect no matter what it is you try and stuff, there kind of ended up being abandonment issues there for me. Um, but my mother actually tells a story of me being about 4 years old. And she said that, you know, there was this moment where she was explaining kind of the gospel and Christianity to me. And then she asked me to pray, and she really felt like I really was understanding and taking it in. And so we prayed there in the car. And so that is the moment that she actually considers me to basically get saved. And that's kind of the earliest point that I can reference. But I will say, I have a specific memory of being even 7 years old and praying to the Lord and talking to God on the playground. And so it really was kind of a part of my life throughout most of my young years.
In moving all of those places, were you active in any kind of a church or community? It seems like it would be hard moving from place to place to really be connected.
It was hard, but we were always a part of church wherever we went. And even if you were just in a place for a little while, we were always visiting churches. I really can't remember. There wasn't ever really a long stint in which we weren't in church on Sundays. And when we actually did live in areas, we were often there, the 2, 3 times a week, Sundays, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Church was very much a huge part of my life. Awana, every kind of thing you can imagine, helping take down chairs and all those sorts of things. So church was just, that was part of our lifestyle. It was
Yeah,
always there, always present.
part of your
So, and I'll tell you one other thing that was really interesting because it was such a small moment. But I remember getting up early one morning. My dad usually left for work before we got up when I was really young. But I do remember him having a Bible on the table one time and reading the Bible before breakfast.
Mm.
So that was just kind of one of those seminal moments of kind of actually seeing my dad take time out for his own devotions before going to work. So kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, so it seems then, in a sense, that your parents really, it was a real part of their life that they invested in. They lived. It sounds like they tried to live out, and but you mentioned that your father was a good father, but yet there was a sense of abandonment. Was that emotional or physical? I mean, was it that he was gone a lot because of his military service, or what did that surround?
Yeah, it really was. It was because he was gone sometimes, right?
Mm.
He would be gone for 3, 4 months at a time. And I don't know what it is, but there's something just about being a child where you can't really control, or I'm not really sure how to handle that, right? And so it just ended up being a disconnect emotionally, and I didn't even realize it myself until I was in my later 20s.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it wasn't until later that I even recognized there was anything there. So
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I think growing up in childhood, you just absorb the world that you're in, and it's all of its bits, and that's your normal, that's your reality, and you don't really realize the implications perhaps until later. But so as a child, it sounds like you had a real or um, sincere kind of belief in God, that you prayed to God on the playground. He was a real part of your life in that sense. As you were growing older into teenage years, did that kind of sense of belief or appreciation for God or your faith continue? Did it grow, or what happened?
yeah. No, so God was always a part of my life, it seemed like. No matter what I did, He always seemed to be a huge part of my life. And even growing up in my teenage years, becoming, 15, 16, all those years. Now, the major struggle that I really ended up struggling with was a type of depression. I
Mm,
struggled with serious loneliness because of all of the changes.
mm,
We were homeschooled mostly, and it was good and bad in some ways, right? It was good because of the constant changing of areas, so we always could just bring our school with us, and you didn't have to worry about changing schools and then adapting in entirely new environments. But it was rough in the sense of socialization, right? There are just certain stints where, I remember when we lived in Hawaii, and throughout that time, we were just starting to kind of put down roots, but we only got to stay for 1 year, and then boom, we were off to the next place. And so that was incredibly difficult, incredibly hard. Um, but when I turned like 15, 16, I really became a part of a co-op, which is like a homeschool group full of other homeschoolers.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually became incredibly influential and incredibly important. Now, during some of this section, as I was starting to even gain friends, I struggled with some serious depression and contemplations of suicide and those things. And I've always very much I've attributed my life very much to God in the midst of all of that. I was struggling through it, but I was constantly praying to God in that process, and I was praying to God for friends, and the Lord brought them around, and those friends ended up being actually some of the friends that I still have today. So my best friend Titus was kind of one of the major ones. I met at the co-op right there, and so him and I have been friends for over 20 years now. And
Wow.
he's, just absolutely been one of the hugest parts of my life. And shout out to Chase as well, who I kind of first met there all those years ago. And so, the Lord did. He answered my prayers, and he brought
So
about some friendships that really was impactful. So
wow, that so God showed up.
he did.
Sometimes,
He did.
during those periods of isolation and depression, it's easy to just as easy to push away from God and saying, why is my life like this, and questioning and doubting. But it sounds like He really provided for you during that time.
Well, you know what? I feel like if I didn't have God, I don't know if I would have made it, because there would have been no hope. Like I had hope that God would bring something around, and I constantly, cried out for that help.
Mm.
And there were very much times of temptation, but yeah, I very much had a real hope in God. So
Okay. Well, that's good. But
it is good.
I know you're sitting there before me, and I'm sure our listeners are going, "Well, okay, so he believed in God, great, and God provided." But you had mentioned to me that there were periods in your time where you had really pushed away. What made the turn for you to move from this kind of belief in a God who cared and who showed up and who was real to pushing away from that?
So the real challenge came after high school. So after high school, we're on the East Coast, and personally, I hated the East Coast. If you've ever been to the West Coast of the East Coast, the West Coast is far superior in beauty. And of course, I had all these wonderful childhood memories. So I decided that I wanted to go back to the West Coast. So finished high school, had no idea what I wanted to do. Everyone's like, well, go to college. And I was like, what for? Like, there wasn't anything I wanted to study. There wasn't anything I was passionate enough about to just launch into college. So I called up my grandparents and said, hey, I want to come and basically hang out and stay with you guys for a while and kind of maybe figure things out, maybe start for myself an entirely new life on the West Coast. Hadn't really figured out what I wanted to do. And they were very surprised, but very welcoming. They're like, okay, yeah, sounds great. And so I kind of set off on my journey. But part of that journey was I decided for myself that I would decide if this Christianity thing was my faith or if it was just going to be the faith of my parents. See, growing up, I grew up with it. I believed it. I felt like I had a relationship with God, but I had never seriously challenged it,
Mm.
right? All of my friends were Christians. I mean, of course, I had met some non-Christian friends and had some of those, but for the most part, my life was very insulated and sheltered, like most people would suspect of a Christian homeschooler, right? So I got over there, and I got to spend about 6 to 8 months there. And my grandparents, they live on top of basically a hill, or a very large mountain hill sort of thing. So it's isolated away from the world. Civilization is almost an hour away. right? And when you go to Bob's Market, you actually talk to Bob, that sort of thing, right? You
Yes.
know,
Yes.
normally it's not the same thing. So I'm far removed from the rest of civilization. And so it's here that I decided, like, okay, yeah, I want to see what else is out there. Why do people leave Christianity? Why is Christianity true? Is the virgin birth true? Like, what is going on? Where did Cain get his wife? I mean, every question you can imagine, I wanted to answer all of the hard questions. And so I kind of began my journey. I was looking at atheist forums. I was listening to their questions. I was listening why people left Christianity. I went down to the Mormon church. I went to the Catholic church, the Seventh day Adventists, listened to Muslims. I was listening to anybody who would tell me why they left Christianity, why Christianity was false, why their faith was true. And so this was an intensive process. I was spending 4 to 6 hours easy on this every single day, pretty much. And as a result, I picked up something interesting as well. And I had no idea that my grandpa was well educated, to be honest. I never really talked to him growing up. Pretty much like when we were kids, we would kind of see him. He would just kind of come home from work and sleep. And that was it. So I began to kind of ask him things or whatever and began to find that he knew a lot of stuff. See, at the time, I was very much a rationalist. I was only willing to believe in things that I could understand. And so he presented Christianity and answered my questions in a way that was very different than maybe some other people had experienced. He didn't tell me what the answers were. I would ask him, hey, what about this? And he would kind of say, well, look, here are the ways that some people get to this answer. And here are these answers over here. And he was giving me the answers from the Bible or truths or explanations from different things, but he wasn't handing it to me and just telling me, this is the answer, ignore everyone else. He gave me different reasons for different things. He gave me why skeptics believe this, why Christians believe this. And he gave me the freedom to choose for myself. He never told me you have to believe this or you have to believe that. And I very much have thought that if it wasn't for him handling me in this way, that I very likely would have become an atheist because I was very truth oriented. And at this point, I did not care at all about personal experience arguments from other people. Anyone that shared their testimony, I just could care less. I wanted the objective truth. What is real and objective beyond anyone's personal opinion or experience? And so it was a long process. And I also had like a few of my uncles. I was asking uncles, cousins, and other churchgoers. I was that annoying guy you did not want to talk to in church at the time. Because guess what? If you said something wrong, I was about to show you where your logic went wrong. And yeah, it was a rough time for those around me in some ways. But that's all I was doing. I was constantly writing notes on paper and asking questions. And every new question I had, I was asking everyone around me. And for me, at the time, Christianity was very much one whole piece. And that's really, really important and significant because at this point, I very much felt like if there was a question that was an objection to Christianity and I could not answer it, I would reject Christianity. I would turn my back on the whole thing. And I was prepared to do that. But at the end of this 6 to 8 months, I became compelled to think that it was true. Christianity was true. And I think that it was also very important to me that I also felt a sense of the Holy Spirit with me at times. And so there was a combination of personal experience and answering the questions that I had. The Christians they've answered the questions very well as to what I was wondering about and gave me plausible explanations. So at that point, I had believed that Christianity was true. And that was my first major challenge to Christianity. So I did have a second one in my 20s.
Yeah, and before we go there, I think it's a very important, well, it's a few things to draw out there. First of all, is that you had a conception that it was a rather all or nothing enterprise.
Hmm.
That if you, it's like the Jenga tower. If you pull out
Yes.
one piece of the puzzle and it collapses, then the whole thing is worthless. Rather than looking at that there might be, some areas that weren't completely certain in terms of answering, or, that might provide a little bit of doubt, but yet the whole of the structure is still supported. It's still pretty foundational, supported foundationally, but yet you were in an all or nothing mentality. I'm curious, as you were um, looking at other faiths and religions, I would imagine that they had their own Jenga towers and they had
Hmm.
their own areas of weakness, and that were causing doubt or suspicion. Were you in that you were in your honest search? Did they have holes in their foundation, or were there particular things that you just said, okay, I've looked at Islam and that's not it,
Hmm.
or I've looked at Mormonism, or I've looked at whatever? Were there more doubts as you looked at those than there were at Christianity? I mean, the way that it sounds is that you didn't find any holes or doubts or problems with Christianity as you were searching and looking at it more closely.
Yeah, so I want to be as charitable as possible, but here was the thing. I literally did. I went down to the churches and I talked and argued about like some of the major holes or points in these other faiths. I remember a couple different conversations. One at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I brought up some of the issues of their dietary laws and dietary thoughts. And one of the issues in Seventh-day Adventism, they believe in the traditional Jewish diet, right? Well, I read what Paul says in the New Testament, and he says, what's he talking about here? He's talking about the food and dietary laws. And I know and am sure on the authority of the Lord Jesus Christ that nothing in and of itself is wrong to eat. Quoted that verse to the guy, and he's like, well, you got to read it from its original context. And I said, okay, cool. So we started from the beginning of the passage, read the whole thing, and then he just kind of sat back and said, well, but there's all these health benefits. And it was like, clearly, I was like, dude, this is a major slam on your entire system here. And he just decided to ignore it. And I was like, yeah, so I poked holes in in all of his stuff, and he didn't have any reasonable answer to me at the time. And then we went to the Mormon church, and I poked holes in a bunch of stuff that they had brought up. And so I was finding significant holes. These ideas of Mormonism, how it came about, almost certainly that Joseph Smith was, a charlatan and a manipulator. Like there were constantly big holes in each one of these. Now, I will say, if you talk to apologists in any of these fields today, they're much stronger than what I encountered back then. So I'm not at all going to say that, like, oh, that's just so easy to poke holes exactly in each one of them today. But it was very significant. Yeah, I definitely seemed to poke holes in so many of these ones, and I thought of each of their faiths as well as pretty monolithic. That it's just a matter of, if I could poke holes in your faith, I wasn't going to believe it. I wasn't going to hold on to it, And so I felt like I was getting way more answers from the Christian side. And those that I talked with on the other sides, they weren't really presenting me with anything significant. So
I'd like to pause for a moment and tell you about a new opportunity. The C.S. Lewis Institute is now accepting applications for the Fellows Program. This program is a 12-month discipleship course that focuses on monthly themes related to theology, spiritual formation, and apologetics. Through the structure of a strong curriculum, like-minded community, and one-on-one mentorship, our fellows encounter a life-changing experience where they grow deeper in their faith as disciples of Christ. Offered in 16 cities, the Fellows Program is for Christians who are seeking to broaden their Christian education and deepen their personal faith. To learn more and to find out if you live in an area where the Fellows Program is offered, please visit our website at www.cslewisinstitute.org. Now back to our story. And even all of those online discussions or presentations from atheists or skeptics, those weren't convincing for you either, it sounds like, when oftentimes, atheists are pushing back pretty hard, and they can be very rhetorically, compelling and persuasive. But it sounds like the due diligence that you were conducting with regard to the Christian perspective, you felt like that was more firm or more solid and more truthful, I guess you could say, than what you were finding from the naturalistic side.
Yeah, I just wasn't finding any significant arguments that weren't, at the time, pretty much sufficiently answered. They were giving arguments as like, oh, well, maybe the virgin birth wasn't real because in Isaiah there isn't really a word for virgin and it's just young maiden and all these things. But ultimately, like, there seemed to be very plausible, very reasonable Christian answers to these objections. Atheism didn't really posit anything positive. It only takes crack shots at Christianity, right? But it doesn't really offer you something to grab onto. Now, that was enough, though. Like, if atheism was going to be able to point out contradictions, sure, it was going to cause me to leave Christianity. I was very much focused on the arguments. The intellectual arguments were everything to me back then. Now, I will say today, I think very differently. I think that there's a lot to be said for personal experience. But back then, none of it really mattered. I wanted to remove the personal experiences from the arguments as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, it sounds like you were trying to be as intellectually honest as you possibly could in that search. And then you landed in a place of confidence that Christianity was true. You said until your 20s. And then something happened.
Yes. So then we hit my early 20s, and the new wave of atheism had just been starting to hit much more mainstream, more prominent. The Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Michael Shermer, all these guys were coming on the scene. There were very few apologists back then. I really only remember a couple. And so that really got me into listening to all of this stuff because, see, I was a rationalist. I only was willing to believe what I could understand. And at the time, Christianity had answered all of the questions that I had.
Right.
But now came the new wave of atheism, and they were asking new questions. And I was very, very seriously hunting down the answers as rapidly as possible.
What kind of questions were the new atheists asking at the time? Do you remember?
There were a lot, because pretty much, for instance, talking about the beginning of the universe. Could the universe be eternal? It's like, oh, well, if the universe is eternal, that sounded like a very good objection to me against Christianity. The universe is eternal, therefore it's always existed, therefore it has no need of God, and God also could not have created it, right? So that sounded like a very strong objection to me. And of course, I felt like William Lane Craig's cosmological argument was a very strong answer to this type of objection. And for me, the philosophical arguments were very, very powerful. The idea that time cannot be infinite in the past, that was a very strong refutation of this type of eternal argument. The moral argument, right? Is morality actually subjective or objective? Or what about the problem of evil? Absolutely. Those were very serious objections. And then honestly, there are a lot of other objections that are very, very intricate. I was thinking about all sorts of the interesting arguments or questions, such as, does God love those people in hell? Like, is it possible for God to love people in hell? Or arguments such as, is there free will in heaven? Right? So the idea of free will, how does free will tie in with morality? If we don't have free will, then is God a moral monster? So like a lot of these questions were all coming up to me, and I was eager to answer all of them. But the thing I was noticing, of course, is that after a few years of trying to answer every single objection that anyone can come up with, I was getting tired. Like it was exhausting because for me, the answers were more important. They were more important than simply, oh, now I have an answer for this. No, it was about my salvation and faith as a whole because I still had a very glass ceiling view of Christianity. Christianity was all or nothing. If an atheist cracked this and showed that there was a serious Bible contradiction, I was like, okay, that's it. Like Christianity is false. And now, of course, I look at that as almost absurd. Like, oh, if there's one Bible contradiction, it destroys everything. But yeah, I was answering, Bible objections, contradictions in the Bible, difficulties. What does this mean? What does that mean? Yeah, I was trying to reconcile all of those things.
Were you doing this independently, or were you still in community trying to ask other people and try to absorb information from a kind of a sound community? Or were you trying to wrestle through everything on your own?
Yeah, I mean, in community in a way, but I only had a few few people I could talk to about stuff like this.
Yeah.
One actually was still my grandfather at the time. I would call him periodically and be like, hey, so and so saying this. Like, what? How do you answer this? How do you respond to this? Some were a few other friends. The vast majority of my friends are not, or were not even, apologists or anything. Like I said, at the time, there were very few. Mostly what I was doing was I was consuming a ridiculous amount of YouTube. I watched, pretty much every debate that William Lane Craig had out back then. Oh yeah, I'm watching, I'm listening to the objections and his answers, and every time I found a new question, I'm looking for, okay, what's the answer to this one or that one? And so, yeah, but other than that, this was largely independent. I'm doing all the research on my own, listening to philosophers and punching in their questions online. So yeah, it was pretty independent.
So through this process, you expressed that it was tiring.
Yes.
But I wonder, was it starting to poke holes in your view of Christianity? Was it causing doubt? Were any of these questions seemingly unanswerable? I mean, when the standard is certainty in every area, that's a very high bar. So I wondered, did your faith or belief start to crumble at all through this process?
In a sense, yes. Or I guess I would say I did have points of serious doubts, right? When I would run into a question and the answer was not easily available, right? I'm looking at and like going like, okay, like this seems like a problem, right? One example would be, the arguments from God's incomprehensibility. It's the idea, or you could say that God is logically incoherent. In other words, we always say that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Like he's all good, he's all powerful, he's all knowing, and that like and some people posit that there's some sort of logical contradiction here. And for me, that was very troubling at the time. And I was like, okay, well, if that's true, then Christianity has to be false. And some of these things they would, right? So that's what I mean. Like when I would stay up at night and if a day went by where I didn't find the answer, oh yeah, it was bothering me. It's gnawing on me. The voice just constantly nagging you. Hey, what about that? What about that? What about the doubts? What about, this question that you don't have the answer to? And so that's why it was so tiring because I felt like I had to find the answer. It was just existentially kind of terrifying because I was struggling for meaning and purpose and struggling to find the answers. And That's why it was a big difference, is because I felt like my entire salvation, life, meaning, purpose hung on finding the answer. So, in other words, I felt like if I didn't have the answer, then my entire worldview, my entire life would virtually be a lie. And having all of that hanging over your head while you're trying to find the answer is pretty much like having the guillotine hang over your head. And so my ability to find the answers was my only salvation. I was my own savior. If I couldn't find the answers, my faith was false and I was going to leave. And then, of course, I was going to argue and fight with all of the other Christian apologists who espoused it to be true. And so it was a very serious time for me.
Yeah. Did you ever get to a point where you said, in order to remain intellectually honest in this all or nothing kind of acceptance rejection paradigm, did you ever step back and say, I just can't believe that anymore because I can't answer these, questions? Or did you kind of hang on by a thread, as it were, during those periods of doubt and not leave Christianity altogether?
Yeah, I will say that I made it to the cliff, but I never made it over the cliff.
Mm.
One of the other ones that I want to mention in here a little bit is my brother. My brother has also uh, been a Christian. We've both grown up together, and when we were growing up, we both had devotions, Bible reading, and stuff like that. That was part of our homework in homeschool. And my mother had always prayed. She's like, you know what? The only thing that I really hope and pray for is that my two boys will grow up loving the Lord. And we have, and that's been tremendously wonderful. But my brother has also been somebody who's incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly helpful, and kind of helped keep me as well in some moments. And I think the other thing that makes all of this interesting, right, is that throughout some of these doubts and sufferings, I largely suffered alone. I think it's one of the major struggles in Christian circles is that, especially back then, you can't struggle in public. That's not a legitimate, it's not a legitimate thing. Most people, if you're doubting, then, well, maybe you're not a Christian. Maybe you're going to be pushed out of the church, all those things. So I largely struggled and suffered in silence.
Mm.
But oddly enough, the one who ended up helping me indirectly was my friend Chris Arledge, who is actually studying philosophy. I think he's maybe finished his PhD now, but philosophy of science. And it was during a phone call conversation. And he had no idea what was going through and had no idea that his call would impact me so much. But he was just talking about the Bible, what he was talking about, what his pastor talked about on Sunday. And he's like, yeah, well, you just sometimes need to believe the Bible, even if you can't always understand it, because if you want to only believe it when you can understand something, or only believe God when you can understand something, then you have decided to put yourself as the number one authority. You've decided to put yourself above God, and you're not willing to say, I'll accept something you say just because you say it. And when you make yourself above God, then all of the burden is on you. But if you admit that there is a higher authority, then you can put your faith in that higher authority, even if you can't entirely understand it. And when he said that, it clicked for me. I totally understood what he was saying. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I never thought of that or saw that before. Because skepticism was creeping in really, really hardcore in my life. But the truth about skepticism is that it's empty. And I was feeling that effect. I was feeling the black hole of the next question and the next question and the next question, because every answer I got or every answer I gave had another question behind it. And it's just pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling you down the entire time. And my friend's answer helped me to understand that in order to make progress, you have to believe first. You believe in something, you believe in God, you trust in what God said, and then from there, you can move forward. And that was incredibly liberating. And it absolutely changed my entire Christian faith because then I no longer took Christianity as like, oh, if there's just one false contradiction, if there's just one missing element, my whole faith doesn't shatter. And so it very much put my faith with God in a realm where it became much more personal as well. Because now I was putting my faith in the person and trusting Christ for the answers instead of trusting myself to find the answers. And so that was incredibly liberating.
I imagine that was a huge paradigm shift for you, particularly when you, like you say, truth is truth in terms of intellectual understanding of reality, but truth is also a person, and
Mm-hmm.
and is the person of Christ.
No, I think, and what you say right there is so important,
Why do
right?
you, yeah, why do you
For
say that?
all, yeah, for all of the eggheads out there, right? They're just like, no. Truth is about propositions. It's about claims and stuff like that, right? But Jesus comes and says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And it's like, no. Truth is a person, and there are deep truths that we can understand and experience, right? That are, yeah, they're beyond simply just, oh, propositions and words and stuff like that. You can actually get to know your Savior in a personal way. And that is a truth. Your experiences with God are very legitimate ways of knowing truth. They're not illegitimate ways to come to know God. And so I think that just encountering God is one of the most essential ways. Like, forget about just the arguments. You encounter God yourself, you experience God yourself, and then that can supersede all of your arguments. Someone can make all the arguments they want in the world for why we live in the matrix, but it's like, well, I experience life all around me right now. That's a pretty powerful argument in and of itself. So,
Yeah, it is, and it is, and I love too what you say, and I think for the skeptic, for the one who's maybe listening in, when you say there's a sense of where you have to believe and then understanding will follow, and I think
mhm,
that is there's a real truth to that when you open yourself to not only kind of the rational knowledge but the experiential knowledge of Christ and the way that the Holy Spirit. I know those are very strong Christian concepts for the skeptic or who might be listening, but it's hard to explain the amount of confidence that you can gain relationally from putting your trust in the one who is over all. Uh, but I'm also thinking of the skeptic who's going, well, there were holes in Christianity, and you just decided that that's what you've always known. That's what's comfortable for you. Granted, you didn't get 100%, certainty, but who doesn't any worldview? But beside that, I can imagine a skeptic pushing back on your story and on your journey, saying, but there were holes, and you weren't willing to fill them,
mhm,
um,
yeah.
and you're just not wanting to go over the cliff and become completely intellectually honest and become the courageous atheist who can see reality for what it is. How would you respond to someone like that?
So there are a lot of different answers. One of the answers I want to give is actually an answer that I gave, and I understand that this will not be satisfying to every skeptic, but to some. I had a friend who actually has deconverted and he's lost his faith, pretty much. Okay. And so he's not in the atheist camp yet. And this is not somebody who, has just been like a baby Christian and then they lost their faith. Like, it's been a lot of time in Christianity, very, very knowledgeable about all of these things. And so we had several discussions and we talked about, Christianity and arguments. And eventually, though, at the bottom of it, I was like, hey, look, I recognize there is nothing I could say to you. I cannot argue anything else to you for you to arrive at the truth, because he's so skeptical of everything else. Like, there's no argument. And he agreed. He's like, yeah, you're right. There isn't anything you can tell me, right? Because he has tons of information. And so I was like, okay, cool. But you believe in God, and he still believes in God. And I was like, and God knows everything, right? And he's like, yes, he believes that. God knows everything, right? Even for the skeptic, if you believe that God exists, God knows everything there is, and that God is ultimately the supreme source of truth. So let's just say that somebody corrupted everything else that we know around us, the Bible, personal experience, whatever it is. Ultimately, God's the only one who can answer the question. So I said, fine, then you go to God directly and get the truth. If he's the only one that has it, then the only one that can give it to you is him. Go and ask him yourself. Go and ask him yourself. And I think that that's something that most skeptics that I've known are not actually honestly willing to do. Now, I know that there are some that they're going to go ahead and proclaim, like, I have honestly done that and tried and all of those things. And there's no way that I can directly speak to every individual story. But the one thing that I have seen is that every major skeptic I've encountered, they have their rules that they've created. And this is what I would say. Are you willing to let go of your rules as to what box God has to fit in? Because if God really does exist, then ultimately you would have to be willing to submit to whatever his rules are and not the rules that you've created as to what he has to fit into. Because if God exists, then he is what? The most loving, most compassionate, all-knowing, all good, all created one. And so it's no surprise that whoever the skeptic is, are you the most loving, compassionate person in the world? Most are willing to admit, well, no, I'm not. Yeah, well, God is. And so whatever the answer to most of your quandaries is, I'm sure he has a much more loving, compassionate answer. And maybe he knows something you don't. So being willing to fully submit your ideas to what somebody else who is the ultimate authority has, it's very liberating and freeing.
I'd like to pause for a moment and tell you about a new CSOS small group resource which takes a closer look at one of CSOS's shortest but most important books, The Abolition of Man. We've all felt the effects of the loss of truth and the rise of cancel culture against traditional moral values in our world today. Where can we turn to find a way to deal with these cultural challenges? The Abolition of Man study course may be a terrific resource for you. It will help you understand and engage others regarding issues of truth, morality, and conscience. Through a 5-part video series, Dr. Brian Holan takes us through each chapter of The Abolition of Man and helps us understand C.S. Lewis's perspectives, while also providing key insights from the Bible. This study course can be easily facilitated and led. The entire workbook can be found online, free of charge. If you're interested in this small group study, you can find out more information on the CSOS Institute website at csosinstitute.org. Look for study courses, and there you'll find the Abolition of Man study, along with many other excellent small group study resources. I hope you'll take a look. Now, back to our story. Yes, like you say, it really does take the burden off of you and puts it to the source of all truth, knowledge and love. But I also, it's interesting in talking about, belief towards understanding and trust in a person. I'm sure that there are those who are listening to who would, in a sense, in their skepticism, they don't have all of the answers within their own worldview. Whatever that worldview is, apart from God, they have to make a lot of presumptions for their worldview to be true. There's a lot that they don't know. There are a lot of answers they don't know. They don't know, for example, how the universe came from nothing by nothing for no reason, or, they can't explain how things have the appearance of design, but there is no designer. whatever the thing is, how life started from non-organic life. There are a lot of holes in that Jenga tower, but yet there's a degree of belief in that system, even though they don't have all of the answers either. Um, and so when Christians like you and I say, we believe in a person, that there is God and he's fully explanatory, there is I guess you could say, a condescension towards, oh, you just believe, you just have faith that, but yet there's a faith component to even godless worldviews.
Mhm.
Um, can you speak to that for a minute? In that, just because a Christian says that they have belief or faith in God, even though they may not have all of the answers, that is a legitimate way to view a worldview or trust in reality, because, that they are doing the very same thing.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. We all have our own blinders, and so much of it falls into like confirmation bias and all those things. And even so, for those that are skeptics and atheists, they're like, it was like, well, you're the one that has faith. You're the one that believes in all this other stuff. But it's like, okay, cool. How does science work? Like, did you do all of the scientific experiments? And it's like, well, no. Science is predicated on faith, right? Because even the scientists who do the work are basing their work on what? The guy who told them before them, right? You don't go back and repeat the same experiments. There's no escaping faith, right? And it's like, oh, well, in Christianity, we have faith in people and what they told us from before. And we have faith in, to me, the one major thing that we have that everyone else doesn't have is we actually have faith in a God who comes to bring revelation. But yeah, so all of the skeptics, they have faith in something else that's outside of them. And it's a matter of choice to some degree. What do you choose to put your faith in? Is it science? And is it because you have such faith in humanity that other human beings are telling you the truth? Because, people are like, oh, well, science is obviously, true or more ethical or believable because, oh, well, we can test it. Okay, I understand, right? A lot of people will say you can test it, you can repeat it. Did you test it? If you repeated all of the scientific experiments that they told you about work? And of course, the answer is no, right? They simply believe, the books, and they believe that the other people that came before them are telling them the truth. So there's no escaping it. Whether you believe in scientism or Buddha or any of those things, everybody has trust and faith because nobody can go back through and do all of the same things that have come before them. So
Mm.
that's a very practical human aspect to life. You have to
Yes.
put your faith and trust in something.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you had characterized your earlier Christianity as being monolithic, a rather all or nothing kind of, if there's
Mhm.
a hole popped in the balloon, the whole thing
Yep.
is up in the air, right? So, but it sounds like you have, I don't know if matured is the right word, but advanced in the way that you
I hope so.
perceive, yes. Hopefully, all of us are in a period, in a time of growth as we understand our world and our worldview better. But it sounds as if it's no longer kind of an all or nothing proposition that, in the Christian worldview, that there is, I guess, what some would call a cumulative case,
Mhm.
that involves so many different aspects of understanding reality, whether it's rationally or whether it's experientially, through our knowledge or the person of Christ, or all of these things that work together in a cohesive, kind of comprehensive way that seems to match with reality. That say you have, your puzzle, you're missing a piece here or there because of a doubt. I'm not really sure how.
Mhm.
Like this piece over here works, or that, I don't have an answer to that. But for the most part, 90% of my puzzle is complete. Seem to have a pretty comprehensive and understandable and intelligible view of the world and of myself. And all of those things, how they all fit together. Would you say so that it doesn't feel as fragile It feels more confident, not certain, because, again, in our own limited understanding, we'll never know everything in this life. Only God is omniscient, as you say. So, how would you speak to the way that you view Christianity now, as being confident, not certain, but it's not as fragile maybe as it once was?
I'll put it this way, right? So it's like you actually used a couple interesting terms like confident but not certain and all of those things. But there's a big difference between like having philosophical certainty, meaning like mathematical proofs. But yeah, like I can be reasonably certain, right? And I mean that like justifiably certain. I'm certain and confident that that I'll see Jesus when I die, that I'll be resurrected again, that there is one God in heaven, that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And it's like, well, how can you know that? How can you have certainty, right? And that's a degree of faith, right? I have faith, I have belief, I have confidence though, right? So your faith is only as good as the object as it's placed in. And I believe that if God exists, right, then his character is something to have much more certainty than my own thoughts or mind. And so if I place all of the burden on what I know, what I believe to be true, well, then the burden is on me, right? But if I'm placing my trust in something outside of me that is greater than I am, that knows more than I am, who is more moral than I am, then I have a much stronger foundation. And it's almost puzzling to me as to why other people don't even see this issue of it's like, okay, everything that I believe and I must be able to understand it, that's what I'm going to be responsible for. And at first you might think it's like, well, that gives me lots of control. And it's like, it might, but have you ever thought about how finite you are? Have you ever thought about how much you know? How much information do you have about the entire universe? Or let's just say just our galaxy. And I think if you stop and think about it, it's a very small amount of information. We as human beings understand very little as a whole. I think you need to try and find the one true God and put your faith and trust in him, because I think that revelation is greater than wisdom. Wisdom is only as good as the presuppositions and the foundations upon which it's built. But when God reveals truth to us, then you should grab hold of it. So,
yes, thank you for that. Adam, you have, taken us on your journey through skepticism and back. Thankfully, you didn't go over the edge of the cliff, but it sounds like you've made it back to a very solid place, where you're placing your trust in the one who actually knows it and is truth and can reveal it. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your story before we kind of turn the page?
Yeah, I think that honestly, one of the major things that I think is the most important is for anybody to have a personal relationship with God. A personal relationship with God completely supersedes all of the arguments, all of the evidences, and it's the most immediate way that people actually do know God. If you're a skeptic and you're interested in evidence, you need to take that as a serious consideration, that the primary way you need to encounter God is go to him directly. So I think that can supersede so many things. Somebody can give me evidence points for why something is true, but if I experience it for myself, you can blow right past everything else.
If a skeptic is listening right now and said, "Okay, all right, Adam, how do I experience God? I mean, what would that look like? Even how do I take steps in that direction?"
Mm-hmm. To me, the first thing is treat God like a person. Just treat him like a person and talk with him. Like ask him, hey, Lord, you know what? I don't know if you exist, and be willing to just be open and honest. One of the things that I think is so beautiful about the book of Psalms is David's honesty. he's complaining at God, he's yelling at God, he's frustrated with God, and he's like, are you even up there? Like David himself is like, asking all these things. And I feel like for any skeptic, it's to be as honest as possible. And I'll tell you this as well. Even so, when I was going throughout my own journey, I also felt and noticed I wanted objectivity as much as possible. But I remember feeling resistance, that there were all these different voices inside of my head, and it became difficult to even discern, well, what is objective, what is true. And so you have to fight against, other voices to try and get at the truth, because the other voices, yourself, your own voices in your own head will lie to you. And so you have to kind of counteract that and do your best to be as objective as possible and make honest, heartfelt pleas to God to try and connect with him. And then the second part that I think is super, super important, you have to be willing to sit down and listen, to receive from him, to actually hear and know the truth that he does speak to you. Because the other thing that I've seen that's truly amazing is how many other people have walked away from God who can remember their encounters with God, and they reject it now. They're turning away from their own experiences with God because they're like, no, but now these other evidences are so much better. And so they've even said, it's like, oh, I felt God once, but that wasn't really him. So I'd be skeptical of your own skepticism.
Yes, yes. And I know that there are so many stories. It's a common tale these days of Christians deconstructing.
Yep.
It sounds like you deconstructed without deconverting.
Yeah. I actually have been called a deconstructionist. I don't think it was a compliment at the time, but
No, I think and there's been very, I know that there have been people who've been trying to really clarify what that means. Deconstruction doesn't necessarily mean leaving faith. It's just I guess, opening the box, taking a look inside, seeing if it's worth a belief. But oftentimes the path is towards conversion, over the cliff if they can't find solid answers.
the problem is, right, when you've built a pot incorrectly, right, and it hardens, there isn't really a way to make little adjustments,
Mm,
right? So you have to destroy it, but then build it back up, right? And if you do well with God, that's what he does sometimes with us, right? Because the problem is we've built up our own religion as we want it, and it's all messed up. And then there can be a need for us to kind of deconstruct our faith because we built it on poor foundations. We
mm,
didn't actually have good godly foundations. And you know what? Sometimes it's because of our parents or pastors, and they're all doing the best they can. But deconstructing your faith can be a good thing when you kind of built it in the wrong way.
right.
And that was my problem, was my foundation for my faith was built on rationalism. I built it on rationalism, and it got pretty tall. And it was necessary to crumble that down. But now my foundation is Christ in a way that is so much greater than what it used to be.
Yeah, it was reconstructed in a much more
Yes.
solid way. Yeah. And so you obviously have been on the edge of skepticism. You talk with skeptics. How can we as Christians engage with those who don't believe, who are skeptical of our beliefs? You've hinted at a few things. I know it sounds like you have um, very good and open and honest conversations with others. Um, how can we benefit from your wisdom in this area?
I have two major things to say on this, and I'm passionate about this issue. One, just because of my own stories, and of course of how many of people that I've seen, right, that have all deconverted, deconstructed. And part of the reasons, I totally get it. And I feel like if I had been treated the way that they were treated, I would have left too.
Mm,
Because of, yeah, let me get into this part. Okay, so number one, how you treat a person is you need to look at them very individualistically. People are very different. And I was shocked and amazed to realize, as I was studying apologetics, and everyone wants to know in Christianity, what's the best argument for God's existence? And that completely depends. That depends on the individual. Some people are focused on science. Some people are history people. Some people are philosophy people. Some people are pragmatic. And some people are experiential. And so depending on the person, the arguments look entirely different. But the one thing that I want to add in here that I feel like I haven't seen enough is for people to understand how to love intellectuals. All right. So there are honest skeptics and there are kind of dishonest skeptics where they're not really looking for a serious conversation. They're just poking questions to make fun of you or mock you. But then there are those who are honest skeptics where the answers really, really matter to them. And I want you to picture this. Imagine that somebody comes into your church and you're the first one to greet them. And you can see that they are noticeably distraught and upset and everything like that. And you ask them, hey, what's the matter? And they tell you, it's like, my dad just died like yesterday. And I'm really, really having a hard time with it. It's really, really bothering me. And I'm even struggling with my faith and how to respond to God. And the first words out of your mouth are, well, you shouldn't struggle with that. You just need to have more faith. Almost everybody realizes how unbelievably absurd that is to give a response like that. How can you be so cold? How can you be so callous? That is exactly how it feels for an intellectual to come into a church and ask you, where did Cain get his wife? And you to say, you just need to have more faith. Because the question for them is personal. The question itself is personal. And so just sitting there and listening to their question and saying, that's a really good question. Let me help you find an answer for that. It's caring for them. But to give them dismissive answers, you are indirectly telling them, I don't care what you think. I don't think your question is important, and I don't care that you think about it. That's what you're telling them. You're being uncompassionate. So for those that are honest skeptics, be patient with them, listen for their questions, seek to answer them.
Yeah, it's amazing how a little bit of valuing the other goes such a long way. You know, when you listen towards understanding and you're really paying attention to the things that are really on someone's mind and on their heart, it's incredible how that will produce an openness in them. You know, when you care to listen, like you say, it seems like a very simple little thing, like, oh, that really would matter with them, but it matters a great, great deal, you know, whether or not someone even will consider Christianity based upon how we respond to others, whether we put them off or we actually sit down as you did and spend time with someone. What a beautiful story that is. And Adam, you have brought so much today. You're not, the classic, I was an atheist, now I'm a Christian, but I love the struggle, because I think that practically speaking is where we find a lot of people are right now, just kind of looking at Christianity all or nothing kind of thinking and leave it behind. But they don't really know, they may know what they're rejecting, but they may not know exactly what they're embracing in a worldview without God. And I think you brought such a beautiful wholeness to your story, not only that you ended up reconstructing your faith, but that it wasn't onerous upon you. You really found the source of truth and the one who reveals truth to you. And it's obviously changed your life, and you're helping other people to find Jesus as well. So thank you so much for coming on and being so honest through your doubts and through your skeptical journey. I think it will be so helpful to many people out there listening today.
Well, I hope so. Thanks so much for having me, Jenna. It was a great pleasure being here.
Thanks for tuning into Sci-Fi Stories to hear Adam Terry's story. You can find out more about Adam's YouTube channel, Curious Christianity, his social media links, as well as his new book entitled It Was Never About Adam in the episode notes. For questions and feedback about this episode, you can contact me through our email. Again, that's info@scibystories.com. Also, if you are a skeptic or atheist who would like to connect with any of our former guests with questions, please contact us through our email and we'll get you connected. This podcast is produced through the C.S. Lewis Institute through the help of our wonderful producer, Ashley Decker, audio engineer, Mark Rosera, and video editor, Kyle Holt. I hope you'll enjoy it, that you'll follow, rate, review, and share this podcast with your friends and social network. In the meantime, I'll be looking forward to seeing you next time, where we'll see how another skeptic flips the record of their life.